will have all the land that was so righteously acquired through a just war and a most liberal payment in money. Ain't that patriotism and Christian faith for you?" added Mr. Hackwell. "For yourself, since it comes from one of the pillars of your congregation," answered Mr. Hammerhard, laughing. Mr. Hackwell, too, joining in the laugh and touching up the horse, which tripped as he always did when pretending to trot, and the quickened motion caused the crazy vehicle to join in also with a series of squeaks, which made Mr. Hackwell's blood curdle and set his teeth on edge, although a philosopher. Whilst the two divines thus beguiled their way to the depot, the subject of their conversation, Mrs. Cackle, made hers laboriously towards home, thinking what pretext she could invent to be at Dr. Norval's when he arrived. I would give worlds to know his version of his conduct. Maybe, like Mr. Hackwell, he won't admit that the native Californians are savages. Of course not, being foreigners. Mrs. Norval, though, will soon show him we ain't to be fooled. She heard, and the squint and the lolling tongue of the parson's horse passed by her as if in derisive triumph. "The aggravating beast!" exclaimed Mrs. Cackle, meaning the horse, just as Mr. Hackwell bowed to her most politely. "Going for the doctor?" said she the divines, as if she thought the turnout needed physic, but the answer was lost in the squeaking of the wheel. "I know they are." "I'll go and let Mrs. Norval know it," said the old lady, and walked briskly on. Jack Sprigg, Miss Lavinia Sprigg's poodle, sat bolt upright upon Mrs. Norval's front doorsteps, watching the shadows of coming events while supper was cooking as Mrs. Cackle came sneaking by the picket fence. Jack was happy, sporting a new blue ribbon around his white neck, and the fragrance of broiled chicken and roasted turkey came gratefully to his nostrils, whilst to his memory came the triumphant recollection that he had helped to catch that turkey who was now roasting, and who had been his bitter enemy, pecking at him unmercifully whenever he dared venture into the chicken yard. Jack wagged his tail, thinking the turkey could peck nevermore, when lo! The round face of Mrs. Cackle, like a red full moon in heated atmosphere, peered over the picket fence. Jack's tail dropped, then a growl arose to his swelling throat. Would that he could put Mrs. Cackle beside the turkey, and who has not felt like Jack? He was a good hater, and ever since he could remember there had existed between himself and Mrs. Cackle a magnetism of repulsion of such peculiar strength that after going to the very extreme, it curled back on itself, and from repulsion came out an attraction which made Mrs. Cackle's feet almost dance with longing to kick Jack, and made Jack's mouth water to bite the well-fed calves of Mrs. Cackle. "There is that miserable poodle, with his wool all washed up white, adorned with a new ribbon," exclaimed Mrs. Cackle, holding to the pickets to catch breath, for she had walked fast. "That old maid Lavvy Sprigg, I suppose, has decked her 1,000 cats and her 1,000,000 canary birds all with ribbons, like her odious poodle." And Mrs. Cackle looked towards the house, but she saw no decked cats there, though the hall door and all the windows were open. In a few moments, however, she espied Ruth Norval, eldest daughter of Dr. Norval, sitting by one of the parlor windows, rocking herself in a chair, reading a fashion magazine. "There is Ruth, as usual, studying the fashions. If her father's funeral was coming, she would do the same," said Mrs. Cackle, and peered at the other window. "Who's there?" she said, putting her fat chin over the pickets to take a better view. She had distinguished a face so flattened against the window pane that it had lost all human shape, but she rightly conjectured that the face belonged to Mattie Norval, youngest daughter of Dr. Norval, inasmuch as Mrs. Norval was too dignified to go and mash her face against the window glass, and Lavinia's high nose would have presented the same obstruction as her sister's dignity. Mrs. Cackle saluted the flattened mass, but it gave no token, only it looked more flattened than ever, as now Mattie riveted her gaze more intently in the direction of the railroad depot, saying to her sister Ruth, "Don't look up, Rudy. Study the fashions. There is old Cackler's moon face on the picket saluting, but I don't see it." "'Deed I don't. I'm looking down the road." "Tell your mother I heard the whistle," bawled out the old lady, holding to the pickets. "I wish she had heard the last trumpet," said Ruth. "Don't answer her, Mattie. She wants to be invited in. Why don't she go home? I see all the young cacklers in their setting room, as she probably calls it, all watching for Papa's coming to begin their cackling." "Ruth, I have told you not to make puns on Mrs. Cackle's name. It is very unkind to do so, and in very bad taste," said Mrs. Norval from the corner. "Look, Ma, the exquisite Mr. Hackwell makes puns all the time. I asked him why he kept the comic Blackstone among his theological books, and he answered, In abjuring all that pertains to the worldly profession of the law, I permitted myself the privilege of keeping this innocent punster. And the innocent punster, Mr. Hackwell the divine, keeps between Kant and Calvin, above Martin Luther, Ma. Here he is, screamed Maddie, interrupting her sister, and all flocked to the window. A light wagon, followed by another so heavily loaded that 4 strong horses could hardly pull it up, approached the gate. "What on earth is he bringing now?" exclaimed Mrs. Norval, looking at the light wagon in alarm. "More rocks and pebbles, of course, but I don't know where he is to put them. The garret is full now," said Ruth, looking at the large wagon. "He will store them away in the barn loft where he keeps his bones and petrified woods. He brings quite a load." "It's a government wagon," added Lavinia, also looking at the large wagon. "I don't mean the boxes in the large wagon. I mean that red shawl," stammered Mrs. Norval. And now the 3 other ladies noticed for the first time a figure wrapped in a bright plaid shawl, leaning on the doctor's breast, and around which he tenderly encircled his arm.
Thank you for listening to Penguin Classics On Air. All of the books mentioned on the show are available wherever books are sold. Visit us again for more programs on great classic books.